Good evening. My name is Marc Mamigonian. I'm the NAASR Director of Academic Affairs. It's been a while, so I thought I should point that out. I'd like to welcome you tonight on behalf of NAASR, as well as the co-sponsors of tonight's program, the Armenian Mirror Spectator, the Armenian Society of Boston, and the Society for Armenian Studies. And before I say any more, I would like to introduce and ask to speak NAASR's new Executive Director, Silva Sedrakian. I say new because although she is now starting her sixth month at NAASR, in the overall scheme of things, that's pretty new, and she has been hard at work and immersed in NAASR's day-to-day work from day one back in December of 2021. You can read all about Silva's outstanding background in the current issue of our newsletter, and I would encourage you to do so. We are fortunate to have her and to have her with us tonight and to ask her to speak. Silva.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to NAASR. Welcome to our building, and for those of you joining us on Zoom, welcome as well. I'm very honored to be part of this community, and the commitment and the dedication of the members are really the force, the driving force for me in my day-to-day job. Anyhow, this evening is very special for us because of two reasons. One, we have the honor of hosting our distinguished guest, Dr. Richard Hovannisian, with us, and we look forward to his talk. And second is because we have our first in-person event in our building, one of the very first. So thank you very much for your support. Thanks for attending, and enjoy the evening.
Thank you. Yes, we had one in-person event a month ago, a children's book reading, which was wonderful, and this is the second such event and the first sort of evening lecture. And the last time I stood in this room, at least in front of an audience, was February 27th, 2020. The building was brand new. In fact, it wasn't even finished. We had a lot of plans at that time for spring of 2020 and summer of 2020 and fall of 2020, plans which, like so many other people's plans, had to be changed. And like many others, we started working remotely here, and by May of 2020, NAASR was fully up and running with our online programming. It's been important for us as an organization that although our building was closed to the public throughout 2020 and gradually became more accessible on a limited basis in 2021, we never stopped doing our work. The bookstore continued to sell books online. In fact, the online bookstore grew and improved. The cataloging and organization of our library proceeded. Researchers with requests for materials from our collection got what they needed. Grants to scholars continued to be issued, and programs moved from in-person events that reached only those who attended in person, obviously, to online events that were viewed all around the world, allowing us in many ways to expand our reach and increase our audience, bringing the work of the many scholars and authors featured in our programs to people who had been craving just that sort of programming. And I need to acknowledge with respect my full-time co-workers at NAASR, Sarah Ignatius, now our ex-executive director, Silva, our current executive director, Lori Ardumian, our program and administrative associate, Ani Babaian, library curator, as well as part-timers and interns, including Nareg Kalajian, Miles Mamigonian, he's related, Sarah McAleer, as well as our wonderful volunteers. And hardly last but not least, or last but hardly least, our board of directors, so well led by our chairman, Yervant Chakijian. This might be a good time for me to mention, please turn off your cell phones. That's on the positive side. On the minus side, of course, the direct contact with our members and friends was disrupted. As we move forward and try to adapt to whatever the pandemic or anything else might throw at us, we'll strive to keep both the directness of in-person programs and the reach of our online programs. That's what we're trying to do tonight, to ease our way back into this particular world. And although I want this first in-person event at NAASR in more than 2 years to be purely a joyous occasion, we would be remiss not to remember that during the time since then, many people dear to us have been lost, whether because of the pandemic or other causes. A terrible war has been fought in the fall of 2020 that brought great suffering to Artsakh and Armenia. Let's have a moment of silence for those who are no longer with us. Well, we're in the midst of a very busy month of activity at NAASR. Let me just briefly mention several upcoming programs. Tomorrow, May 7th at 2 p.m., a webinar with Dr. Bedros Dermatosian, The Horrors of Adana, Revolution and Violence in the Early 20th Century, co-sponsored by NAASR and the Society for Armenian Studies. Next Wednesday, May 11th, a webinar with Carol Bertram, A House in the Homeland, Armenian pilgrimages to places of ancestral memory, co-sponsored by the Society for Armenian Studies and NAASR. Thursday, May 12th, a webinar with Silva Marian, Reproducing the Resurrection from European Prints to Armenian Manuscripts, co-sponsored by the Michigan Center for Early Christian Studies and NAASR. And Sunday, May 15th, the V-Shop, From Fairy Tale to Reality, an exhibition and lecture with Arsen Babokian, a hybrid event at UCLA Royce Hall. I think Professor Hovannisian knows where that is, and organized by the Naragazi Chair in Armenian Studies and co-sponsored by NAASR and other groups. And finally, on Tuesday, May 17th, back here, another hybrid in-person and online event, Poets in Conversation, Shahe Mankarian with Susan Barba. We hope you can join us for those events, whether in person or online or somehow both. Back in 2016, which seems like it might have been in another lifetime, NAASR celebrated its 60th anniversary, and part of the gala was a tribute to two scholars, Professor Nina Garsoyan and Professor Richard Hovannisian, honoring their immense contributions and formative influence on Armenian studies in America. Professor Garsoyan recently celebrated her 99th birthday. Professor Hovannisian, a youngster, is here with us tonight. In 2016, it was decided that in the new building, Professors Garsoyan and Hovannisian would be honored with a plaque. And indeed, on the front of this lectern, I think I'm touching it right there, there is a plaque recognizing them for their, quote, profound contributions to Armenian studies. This now is the part where I'm supposed to say that our speaker needs no introduction, which is, of course, partly true, but also patently false. He does need an introduction. I've had the pleasure of introducing Professor Hovannisian at least a dozen times over the years, probably more, and one struggles to come up with new approaches or clever things to say. So let me skip that and just recite a few facts. Richard Hovannisian is the author of Armenia on the Road to Independence, the 4-volume history of the Republic of Armenia, and editor and contributor to more than 35 books, including seminal works such as The Armenian People from Ancient to Modern Times, several important collections on the Armenian genocide, and 15 volumes of proceedings from the UCLA conference series, Historic Armenian Cities and Provinces, of which Armenian Communities in Persia and Iran is the last. He joined the UCLA faculty in 1962 and was the first holder of the Armenian Educational Foundation Chair in Modern Armenian History, which now is named in his honor. I can state as a fact that no one in the past 60 years has done more to put Armenian studies on the map, and certainly no one has done as much to advance and give legitimacy to the study of modern Armenian history. No one has done as much as Richard Hovannisian, that is. He has indeed made profound contributions to Armenian studies, just like the plaque says, and we thank him for that. Professor Hovannisian will speak tonight about Armenian communities, it's down the floor, Armenian communities of Persia, Iran, and he will be joined during the presentation by my esteemed colleague Ani Babaian, NAASR's library curator and a contributor to the volume. The book is for sale tonight only, for tonight only, at a special reduced price. And for those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can get the special price by buying it online as well. One night only, $35, tax included. This is one way you can thank Professor Hovannisian, by buying his book and sparing him the anguish of having to cart them back to California. As I said, tonight is our first hybrid in-person and online event at NAASR, and while the entire online portion is in the capable professional hands of David Medzorian, I'm less confident in my own abilities, but following the presentation, we will have Q&A with people in a room, and we will also attempt to get Zoom questions for those of you watching on Zoom. Please use the Zoom Q&A as per usual. If I fail to get to those questions, I ask for your pity and understanding, and I will try to get it right next time. For those of you in person, again, one more reminder, turn off your cell phone ringers. I apologize for speaking so long. Please welcome Professor Richard Hovannisian.
I feel very fortunate that I'm able to come back to Greater Boston for the first time in several years since we all became homebound and worry-bound, and to be able to see this renewed and rebuilt and expanded beautiful facility that NAASR has, with the inspired leadership that was required to make it a reality. And I thank all those who did that, and to express my admiration also for the degree of activity of this organization throughout all these terrible months that has been a link to those interested in Armenian studies. And the roster of activities in such rapid sequence is most impressive. So thank you very much. First slide. This is the volume that I'm presenting tonight, Armenian Communities of Persia, Iran. I didn't think that I would ever do this volume because all my other volumes in this series dealt with Armenian communities of the Ottoman Empire that are now in Turkey. And I did do 2 conferences on Iran. I did one conference, organized one conference on Jerusalem as well. But I didn't think I was going to publish these, and when I was urged to do so by the publisher, I said there are others who are far more capable than I, because I'm not a specialist of Iranian history or Iranian Armenian history, but there were no takers. They were very smart, because being an editor means you have to spend days and weeks and hours working on other people's writing for which you don't get any credit. And such it is. In any case, I'm glad that we came to this point. Next. I dedicate this to my partner, Vartiter Kochalosian, who for over 60 years not only was a beloved physician, internist, but also my academic partner as we traveled the world together into archives around the world, and her fluency in Russian and in German and Armenian made it so much easier for me to be able to work and put together the volumes that we have done over the years. The basic work that we did and the archives that we went through was to present the history of the First Armenian Republic on as much as possible an objective basis. For those of you even younger than I, as there were not anyone older than I am probably here, we know that our community was torn apart for many years. And a part of the reason was the question of the First Republic. Was it the fulfillment of long struggle for self-determination and independence, struggle to regain Armenian sovereignty after centuries of foreign domination? Or was it a land of death and destruction, of failure, until only the Soviet Russians came to save it? And the symbol of that division in our community, which was not absent of bloodshed, was the tricolor flag of that First Republic. You either loved it or you hated it. And as time went on, I realized that no one was correct. Everybody was correct, and everyone was wrong. And to be able to understand the circumstances under which that republic was born, under the challenges it was faced with, how well and how poorly those challenges were addressed by the leaders of the time, required a great deal of study. And fortunately, of all the archives, or all the places that Vartiter and I went to study the archives, whether it was in the United States or in France or in England or in Germany, wherever it was, or in Armenia, was loaded with information that had never been touched before. And that we were sort of pioneers in uncovering that information and trying to make some sense of it without ever trying to disguise the fact that we were sympathetic to the concept of an independent Armenian state. And so for 30 years, we labored on a history of 3 years, as you see, in the Republic of Armenia. And then, as Marc Mamigonian pointed out, several volumes on the Armenian genocide, not because I'm a genocide scholar, I've never claimed to be, but because I was driven to this field by denial. Denial by the perpetrator side and by academics also who supported or lent credence to the denial, who participated in the denial, including in my own University of California. And that drove me to go into this field by organizing a number of conferences on the Armenian genocide. And I'm gratified that we've made a lot of progress, because when I began in this field, there probably were no more than 5 or 6 books that dealt with the Armenian genocide in a Western language or in English. And today, if you go to the NAASR library downstairs, you'll find that there are scores of studies, very serious studies, on the Armenian genocide. And then the last phase of my life has been dedicated for the last 20 years to organizing conferences on the lost provinces of the Armenian people, where the Armenians rose at Van to peoplehood, and where they continued to endure for centuries after century until 1915 and 1920, when they were violently eliminated, destroyed, and driven from their lands. And as a kind of desperate attempt to keep the memory of these areas alive, I began with this series with Van and Vaspuragan and Bitlis, and have gone now into the 14th was on Musadagh and Kesab and Dortiol along the Mediterranean Sea. And that's where I thought this series was going to end, and I guess I was given a little extra life next in order to come to this final volume that I didn't think that I would ever publish. It's on Iran. And my experience with Iran goes back to my college days. Actually, I had graduated from college and had gone to Beirut for 1 year to learn Armenian. And on the way back, I didn't come back through Europe, but I kept on going eastward through Iraq and Iran and India and Rangoon and onward all the way to Hong Kong and Manila and Japan, and ended up in Hawaii and back to San Francisco in California. And so I was fortunate as a young man to spend my first visit in Tehran and Isfahan, and was really impressed by a lot of things. The wonderful Persian cuisine, which is the best, among the best in the world. And the fact that when I went to, let's wait a minute, when I went to Jhulfah, and I'll talk about Jhulfah a bit, I was really surprised because there was an area that was an Armenian quarter where there were supposed to be 13 Armenian churches, but at first sight I couldn't see them because they looked like mosques. They had compits that looked like domes of a mosque rather than an Armenian church. And then I went inside and I was awed by the fact that there were frescoes from the ceilings to the floor that were commissioned by the very wealthy Armenian merchants of that community. And if you know anything about Armenian churches, you know that they're intentionally made to be very austere and simple, with all attention to the Quran, to the mother altar, rather than looking around to the statues and paintings and so forth. But this was a great exception. And so I was enthralled by Iran. And after I did these two conferences, then I have now published the proceedings of two of the conferences put into one. Among the early authors in this volume are Nina Garsoyan, whom we just heard of as being my senior sister colleague, some 10 years my elder, and Maxime Yevadyan, a young man from Lyon, France, Elizabeth Redgate, who is from England and works on Vaspuragan or Van, Tom Sinclair in Cyprus, who looks also at the early battles between the Persians and the Turks, and they sort of set the background for moving into modern Iranian history and the communities of Iran. Here you see that the Achaemenian Empire that started in the 6th century BC with Cyrus and Darius or Darius, incorporated Armenia as well as most of the population of the world at the time. But even then, when there were Armenian rebellions against the Persians, generals in the Persian army were of Armenian origin, which meant that the Armenians were already there. And when I asked a Persian Armenian historian, when did the Armenians go to Iran? She laughed at me and she said, it's not, Armenians didn't go to Iran. The Persians came to us. We didn't go to them. They came to us and took over areas that had once been known as Barska or Persian Armenia. And here you see the Persian Empire, where in Armenia they did not put members of the Achaemenian royal family, but they let the Armenian princes continue to rule under the aegis of Iran. Next. Here you see the Behistun inscriptions of the 6th century BC, where for the first time Armenia is mentioned. Next. And here we have then the empire of the Sasanians. And again, you see Armenia there in yellow. And again, the Armenians are allowed a great deal of autonomy with their royal princes rather than putting on Sasanian princes on the Armenian throne. This is a time, of course, that Armenians remember most of all Vartan Mamigonian and the struggle for religious liberty in struggling against the Sasanians. But once again, we may forget that even then, there were many Armenians in service of the Sasanian state. Next. Next. We're now in Iran, and the northern part of Iran is known as Azerbaijan. And the main city of Azerbaijan is Tabriz. This is not the country, the former Soviet country of Azerbaijan, or the enemy of Azerbaijan, of Armenia today, the country of Azerbaijan. They adopted that name only in 1918 of Baku. That was not known as Azerbaijan before. Azerbaijan was this area in the north of Iran. It plays a critically important role in Armenian history, because if you look just to the west, beyond the border, you see that right beyond the border lies Van and Vaspuragan, and the connection between Vaspuragan and Azerbaijan were very intimate. In fact, in the entire Armenian liberation movement of the 19th century, it was in Azerbaijan that the Armenians organized their fedai groups, their volunteer groups, that they send weapons across the border into Van, into Sassoon, into other areas of the region. And there was a whole entire history. In many ways, Azerbaijan, in the north of Iran, has a very different history from southern Iran, where Armenians created this huge trading network at Isfahan, which is a history of a later period. But throughout the earlier period, the Armenian communities were located here in the north, in Salmast, in Urmia, in Khoy, in Mazandaran, in Gilan, in Anzeli, and on and on. There were hundreds of Armenian villages and communities in Karadagh also, across from Karabakh, the Arax River, just south here. And they have a very, very rich history. And here you see this map. Next. very few people probably know that in the very northern part of Azerbaijan is a city known as Maku, M-A-K-U, which is right across the river, the Araks River, from Nakhichevan. And here the Armenians had a principality known as Ardaz from the 13th to the 15th century. And this is the great cavern of Khoi. Next. Here you see the bridge built by Armenian artisans over that river at Maku. Next. And here is the Armenian inscription that is on the bridge in this community. Next. One of the presenters on my conference on Iran was a wonderful scholar and architect whose name was Hovannisian, who did a paper on the northern Iranian Armenian monasteries, and who unfortunately died between the conferences and the time that I was able to publish this volume. But these are the churches that he described. This is the church of St. Thaddeus, Subtadei Vank. And Armenians of Iran, if any of you is from Iran, all know that in the summertime there are major pilgrimages to this monastery at the celebration of Vartavar, the transfiguration of celebrations, in which they camped out around this church for a period of time and danced and sang and occasionally entered the church. And this is the monastery of Thaddeus. And look how, in what good shape it is. The answer to that is both the Shah's government, before the current Iranian government of the revolutionary Islamic Republic, and the Islamic Republic, the current Iranian government, are taking special care to see that these monasteries are kept in good repute and shape. Surp Thaddeus, next. And another monastery up on these hills across from Nakhichevan is Surp Stepanos, St. Stephen's, the proto-martyr monastery, a huge complex. Next. And the third is just one chapel of another complex known as Zorzor. The Iranians built a huge reservoir in the area that submerged the monastery, but they did take apart one of the chapels and bring it up on a hill and rebuilt it in memory of that monastery. Next. And here's Azerbaijan again. Next. The person on the left is a famous Armenian writer, Rafi, Hagop Melik Hagopian, who was a clarion call he made for Armenian enlightenment and self-help, for resistance. And he traveled through the provinces. He's a native of Persian Armenia, or of Persia, from the region of Salmast, and then lived in Tiflis in what is now Georgia. But he did travels through Turkey and Iran and looked at the oppressed lives of the Armenians and called upon the Armenians to take control of their lives through enlightenment and self-help. And that meant through also taking arms in that self-help. Next. And here you find perhaps the realization of Rafi's call in these kinds of groups of volunteers, fedais, Armenian young men who went to the hills to join the bands and to try to protect the Armenian villages, as here you see the NAASR group, which took revenge on a Kurdish tribe that had massacred a group of Armenian volunteers in 1896 who were retreating from Van to Persia. And here's the leaders of the NAASR Arshavank, or expedition, in 1897. Next. And another famous leader of these Fedaya groups was Nicole Duman with his group. Next. And arms in Tabriz, making arms for the Fedayis. Next. And women were active. For those who are interested in feminist movements, here we find intellectual Armenian women in Tabriz, surrounded by their leader, whose name was Maro, and who were not only intellectuals, but also participated in Armenian revolutionary movements by doing such things as putting arms under their skirts and being able to go across borders and boundaries carrying concealed weapons for the fighters on the other side. Next. And this was one of the monastery of St. Bartholomew on the way to Vaspuragan that was used by them. And the most famous of all the Armenian revolutionary warriors for Iran was a man known as Yeprem Khan. Yeprem Khan took part not only in Armenian movements, but in the Persian revolutionary movement. You know, the Persians had a number of movements against the very oppressive Shahs, who were known as the Qajars, and tried to bring about a constitution in Iran. And in 1910-11, engaged in a revolutionary warfare, which forced the Shahs to make compromises and to give in to them to a certain degree. And Yeprem Khan was a part of the Iranian Persian revolutionary movement. Next. This is the mother church of Tabriz, St. Sarkis. Next. And Nerses Meliktankian is probably the most loved and remembered of all the primates in Tabriz in World War I. And this is something that many people don't know. It was not only a genocide of the Armenians in the Turkish Empire, but the Turkish armies invaded Iran twice, in 1915, when the genocide was taking place, and then again when they withdrew, they came back again in 1918 after the Russian Revolution of 1917, and a second massacre took place in the northern areas of Khoy, Urmia, Salmast, and it was at this time that the Armenians had to flee. And 2 chapters in the volume deal with this period of time in World War I, when in 1915, the Armenians of this region fled northward toward Tabriz and Nakhchivan, and in 1918, they had to flee southward toward Iraq, toward Baghdad. And the here you see what was going on. The head of all the Armenian refugee activities at this time were by His Eminence Archbishop Melik Tankian. Next. And here you see the second exodus is southward. Next. And here the refugees from Iran, from Urmia, now down in Bakuba, which is in the vicinity of Van. And that's why if you know any Iraqi Armenians, 80% of the time they'll be their descendants of these people or the Armenians of Van, because the Armenians of Van also fled southward to Iraq and made up the basis of the Baghdad Armenian community. Next. Here is a map of that northern area. It probably doesn't show very clearly, but there's Salmast, Urmia, Khoi along Lake Urmia. And it was not only the Armenians who were victimized at the time, because there's a very large Assyrian, Asori community, Christian community in this region as well. One of the authors wrote about Khoi and her grandfather's experience. She's also a painter, and so we've included 3 or 4 of her paintings that recall as she imagined Khoi would have been. Next. And here is again a reconstructed Armenian church where there are no more Armenians. Khoi, in this whole area of Salmas and Khoi, unfortunately, the Armenians have all gone. They've either migrated to Soviet Armenia or to Tehran or to America or to somewhere, and instead there are now scores and scores of abandoned Armenian villages with remnants of their chapels. Most of them were not great churches, remnants of their chapels, but in Khoi, their mother church was Surpsarkis and is being now maintained by the Iranian government. Next. Now we come to the other Iran of the south, of New Jhulfah. You probably know the history, but let me have the next slide. Here we have Iran, and in the north you can see Tabriz. This is Azerbaijan or Azerbaijan. And if you go way down south, you'll see Esfahan or Isfahan. That's a southern area. In around the year 1600, that is more than 400 years ago, the Persians had a new dynasty. It was known as the Safavid or Safavian dynasty. And they were in a 200-year war with their neighbors to the west, the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. Turkey and Iran fought for 200 years on the Armenian highland. It's no surprise that hundreds of thousands of Armenians, alone from being killed or dying from starvation, fled during these periods to Western Turkey or the Ottoman Empire or other provinces. And much of Armenia was denuded of its Armenian population. But during that, let's go back for a moment. During that time, Shah Abbas took the initiative and turned the tables on the Turks and won back a significant amount of territory. And a part of that territory was near the Arax River, near what today is Soviet Armenia, or what was Soviet Armenia, what is Nakhichevan, and what is Vaspuragan, or Van. And one of the policies that he followed, however cruel it might seem, was a scorched earth policy. That is to destroy everything so that when the Turks try to come back, they have to live off the land. Old armies lived off the land and the people. If there's no land and no people and no animals and no wheat and no crops, they can't go very far. And this strategy ended up in his forcibly removing hundreds of thousands of Armenians from historic Armenia and forcibly moving them southward across the Arax River, during which thousands of Armenians died. Most of them were villagers, and they scattered around in northern Iran and also in the south. But there was a particular village or a town on the Arax River that was known as Jhulfah. The Armenians know it as Jhulfah. It was a fabulous city with very wealthy merchants who had become a part of the Silk Road and the silk trade and other trade. They were part of the international trade network. Shah Abbas brought these people to his new capital, which he had just built, Isfahan, in the south of Iran. And there he gave them an area across the river from his capital and said, "Here you make your town, and I will see to it that you may live according to your Christian laws. I will not allow any Muslims to live in that area, and you are having your local self-government." And the Armenians thrived. I mean, I continue to be amazed that however wealthy they already were, and however well established were they in trade, how was it that the Jhulfah merchants, who are being displaced by several hundred miles and have to build a new community, are within one generation on the international trade routes once again? And they are in India, and they are throughout all of East Asia. And my first trip, when I traveled back from Beirut from where I had been for a year, way back many years ago, I found out that every single community I traveled to, whether it was Calcutta or Rangoon or Manila, they all had originated in New Jhulfah, from the traders of New Jhulfah. And when they talked about going back for a pilgrimage to their homeland, it wasn't Soviet Armenia, it was not Echmiadzin, it was Jhulfah, to the mother Vank, to the mother church of Jhulfah that they would go to. And next, and here you see, within one generation, the Armenian merchants of Jhulfah are spreading around the world, eastward, all the way to China and Mongolia, and all the way west to Spain and to Amsterdam. Next. I have 3 chapters on the traders of Jhulfah by each one different. One looking at the trade relations between Armenia, or between Jhulfah and Sweden. Armenian merchants were very, very resourceful. They had a whole network of how to do things. They didn't even have to have contracts because they had a system of honor system among themselves. But they also learned how to, well, is the word bribe, or it's to gain favor? For example, by giving an entire throne with precious jewels to the Tsar of Russia in return for getting a monopoly on certain goods and trade. And here you find them going all the way to Sweden, where there was the major, at that time, Sweden was a very powerful country, with Charles XI and Charles XII, and gaining concessions and monopolies from him. And they have now written charters of those, which the authors have looked at. Next. Next. Here we're in Cadiz, Spain, where 12 Armenian merchants have pledged to build a church in Cadiz, which is a port city far to the southwest of Spain. Next. Here you see that church, it's still standing, the Church of Santa Maria. Next. And the tiles that were donated for the church. Next. And finally, we've come to New Jhulfah itself. And here you see those strange-looking domes of the Armenian churches, which, what is it? I would never guess from the outside that it was a church, but it is a church. And there were 12 or 13 of them in a contained area. I mean, from here probably to Belmont village and a couple of blocks around. Next. Here you see 3 of the churches in a very, very small area. Next. And here you see where those churches were, along on the other side of the river. It was a very, very thriving community, which unfortunately over the generations and years has now declined into a rather sleepy, tired, not tired, but sleepy town, and still very, very charming. Next. And this is what I was most amazed with when I went, my first image, into that dome church. Look what's inside. The mosaics and murals and tiles, opulence, what money that took, and how much they had to invest in it, and how many foreign specialists and craftsmen and traders, and how many Armenians as well. And for this section, very fortunately, one of the authors for this section is right here, Ani Babaian, who works here in the library at NAASR. And I've asked her if she would please take over now and present as a good art historian the story of New Jhulfah and its art. So I'm going to ask Ani to come forward. I'm not sure. You're going to stand here and to now take over this section of the program.
Check.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It is a great honor for me to present an overview of 3 chapters of the book. First, I will introduce the 2 chapters of the late Archbishop Goriun Babaian and Sarah Laporte Eftekharian. Then I will present my chapter. The late Archbishop Goriun Babaian, who served as a primate of the New Jhulfah diocese for about 24 years, from 1978 to 2002, is the author of the 10th chapter, entitled Surp Amenapurkij Monastery, or Holy Savior of Norjuga. He presents in detail the complex of Surp Amenapurkij Vang, describing each section and the history of its construction. Surp Amenapurkij Vang complex includes the magnificent Surp Hovsep Arimatatsi Church, the Khachatur Gesarati Museum, the Armenian Genocide Monument, and the Archbishop Chancellery offices, the bell tower, the clock tower, the library, and the printing house. The construction of the outstanding church began in 1655 and ended in 1664. It was renamed Saint Joseph Eramatia because it contained the relics of the saint. The author describes the interior of the church in detail, also referring to the painters. The church is decorated with fascinating murals which show scenes from the Old and New Testaments, the life of Gregory the Elementor, the Last Judgment, floral ornaments, and bands of ceramic tiles. The author presents additional information such as the following. Surpnerse Shnorali Library, which has the second largest collection of the Armenian manuscripts in diaspora after the Mkhitaris. The history of the first printing house in Iran, which was established in Surp Amnapurkijvang by the prelate Khachatur Gesarati in 1636. The history of Khachatur Gesarati Museum, its founding, and the description of art objects on display. The tombstones of the monastery former prelate, priests, and monks, including Khachatur Gesarati and his successor, Archbishop David, whose graves are below the altar. I would add that today the complex also includes a second ethnographic museum and a manuscript restoration department. The 12th chapter of the book is mural paintings in New Jhulfah's All Savior Cathedral and the Bethlehem Church by Sarah Laporte Eftekharian, an art historian, senior researcher, and director of the Pareli collection. Her PhD dissertation was on mural paintings of the New Jhulfah churches and focused on the iconographic aspects of Western influences and discussed the similarities and differences between murals and prints. Her conclusion is interesting. I quote a part. A tension perceptible in these mural paintings between an intention of enriching the Armenian iconographic repertoire by using the important models and the concern not to give away the inherited system of religious and aesthetical values. Before discussing my chapter, I would like to thank first Professor Richard Hovannisian for giving me the opportunity to publish my work and speak today. Thanks to board and my colleagues at NAASR who have always encouraged and supported my work. Thanks to my friends who always patiently listened to my stories of New Jhulfah and did not get bored, instead always encouraging me. Many thanks to the Armenian Society of Boston, which made it possible to print the beautiful pictures in the book in color. My deep gratitude to those who love and preserve our cultural heritage and values. I must also mention a big thank you to Marc Mamigonian for his support. Finally, I am grateful to my parents who are no longer with us, but they created every opportunity for me to dedicate myself to my profession. My chapter, which is the result of many years of studying murals and working on the conservation of murals, is entitled The Murals of New Jhulfah, Isfahan. I begin my article with a brief overview of the history and circumstances that gave rise to one of the traditional Armenian arts, murals, and how it developed in New Jhulfah, then introduce the sources for the study of murals in New Jhulfah. The murals in New Jhulfah fall in two categories. religious, and secular. I discuss separately murals in the churches and murals in the residence. Talking about ceramic arts, painters, and artist decorators, the restoration and conservation projects, and I briefly compared the murals of Isfahan and New Jhulfah. The murals in New Jhulfah were formed in the 17th century, when Safavid Isfahan began to gain international recognition. From 1606 to 1695, 24 Armenian apostolic churches were built in New Jhulfah. Today, 13 churches are standing. Each church reflected the financial capacity of the parish or the sponsor. The churches that were built with the financial sponsorship of merchants such as Surp Asvatzatin, Surp Bethlehem, and Surp Amnapurkijbank were more opulent. The appearances of the churches in many ways resembles mosques, but Armenian artists and artisans had the opportunity to display their talents and skills in the creation of these architectural structures. In addition to their traditions and methods, they adopted local styles and techniques, while also becoming more aware of trends in the contemporary art in different parts of the world. Today, religious murals in New Jhulfah are more protected than those in residential homes. They have always been under the control and care of the local diocese. According to Hishataqaraner, or memorial inscriptions, through the financial support of Jhulfans who were living abroad, churches such as Surp Bethlehem were completely renovated and restored. It was customary for the people of Jhulfah to leave bequests for the repair, maintenance, or improvement of a church. The opposite cases, some residential homes which were destroyed through neglect and passing of time. Only a few of them have been preserved. There is little information about the identity of the artists and of the murals in churches and residences. The quantity of the overall interior designs of the structures and the differences among the patterns of those designs attest to the existence of distinct and separate artisan groups. Until now, no document or inscription has confirmed the involvement of non-Armenian artists in the murals of Armenian churches and residences. Instead, the only preserved inscriptions are the names of Armenian artists, written in Armenian. The Armenian artists were in contact with other local artists, and it is possible that they were in contact with European artists as well. Based on literary sources and inscriptions, I present the painters and artist decorators. Let me just point out that during the restoration of Surp Amnapurkijbank's dome in 2008, an inscription was found in the center of the dome. It contained the names of the previously unknown floral decorator artists, their Hovannisian, Sarkis, and their Kyriakos, dated 1667. Identifying the dome's painters proved that the opulent dome was done by Armenian artists, and their names were added to the known artists of New Jhulfah. After a brief overview of the restoration and conservation projects of the mural paintings, I note that today the Armenian churches are included in the list of planned renovations in Isfahan province. Now, efforts are being made to place Surp Amnapurkijbank on the UNESCO's World Heritage List, adding the previously 3 Armenian historic sites, Surp Tadeos, Surp Stepanos Monasteries, and Zortzor Church in 2008. The mural paintings of New Jhulfah were familiar with the local Iranian art and European Renaissance and modern paintings, as well as with printed images of the Bible of Voskan Yerevanti and previously published Bibles in Europe. Armenian artists were well acquainted with Armenian traditional styles and forms and were able to combine these with the new European methods, creating a novel and unique art form. I believe 17th century art in Jhulfah requires serious study and attention to the preservation, restoration, and presentation of this heritage as a unique phenomenon in the history of Armenian, Iranian, and why not the history of 17th century global art.
Şnorgalçun Siciliani. So we see how distinguished this community has been. And Ani mentioned 17th century prelate, Khachadur Gesaratsi, who was so far-seeing that he arranged for the printing press to come to Jhulfah, created the first printing press of all Iran in New Jhulfah. So really quite a distinguished individual, and who was duly and rightfully revered by the Armenian world, and really we have to also look at the positive side. I mean, new buildings have been built, new museum created, added to, modernized, and so we want to think that New Jhulfah will be a permanent part of our existence. Next. Now, around New Jhulfah, there are scores of Armenian villages, and Armenians overall have been villagers. I mean, many are in the cities. The wealthy ones, the famous ones, come from the big cities. But the basis of Armenian society has always been the farmer, the one that goes out and grows the wheat and chafes it and willow. So let's look at one of the villages around New Jhulfah. Here they are 100 years ago in one of the villages. Next. And you see what they were chafing the wheat in a traditional manner that in all traditional societies, and separating the chaff from the wheat. And here, look at the village of Poloran. Women all dressed in red, and this was on the feast of Vartavar, when I remember even in my youth, people threw water on one another as part of the, especially children in particular loved it because they could throw water on adults at the time. Next. And here you see the same kind of peasant women who made the fabric of much of Iranian Armenian history, because they not only lived here, they lived everywhere in Iran. They were all over, and it was the great migration or transfer of Armenian population to Soviet Armenia in 1946-47 that depopulated many of these areas. They were very patriotic Armenians. And the concept of returning to Armenia was very attractive to them. And they continued. I remember in the 1960s, when I was taking a train from Yerevan to Tabriz. And that on the train coming to Jhulfah, actually it's where the Soviet and the Iranian trains met, was at the border on the Araks. Still in the 1960s, there were large numbers of Armenians who were migrating out of Iran, coming to Soviet Armenia. Many of them, of course, later disillusioned, but had come there with great optimism and thinking that they were going to develop the country, and indeed they did, as we know that all the repatriates who went back did enrich Armenia. Next. The last chapter was written by Leonardo Alician. Leonardo Alician was a most talented Iranian Armenian writer who taught at the University of Utah, was a wonderful poet, and who had a most tragic death in a fire in his home in Utah. And at the conference, he presented a paper dedicated to the New Jhulfan painter, Sampad Dergurerian, whose son became the president of the American University of Armenia in later years. And that son helped to revive that paper and to combine it with a number of Sampad's paintings of New Jhulfah as he remembered it. Next. Here, well, I'm okay. This is the theater of New Jhulfah. The Armenian theater has a history there of 130 years or so, and its first productions were made in 1887 on the left and 1888 on the right. Most of the initiators of the Armenian theater came from the Caucasus, came from Tiflis, and first were in Mazandaran and Gilan, and then they came to New Jhulfah and put on the first productions. Next. And here you find already in 1920, they're putting on an Armenian production of Othello, Shakespeare's Othello. Next. One of the most beloved of all actresses on the Armenian theater was Siranush. Siranush was born in Constantinople, performed in the Caucasus, and then came to New Jhulfah, where she was the darling of the Persian aristocracy and princes. Women actresses didn't have a very great reputation. That's why they gave the roles often to men. But she didn't care, and she actually became the princess of the Armenian theater. And here we find in 2013, the repertoire is changing. These are European comedies that are being translated into Armenian and performed in New Jhulfah. Next. And the founders of the theater on the left side, and this is a 130 anniversary program that was done there a few years ago. Next. Now here's Sampad, whom I spoke of earlier, Sampad Dergurerian. Next. And here are the village scenes of his childhood that he remembers. Next. And Norahars, a new bride of New Jhulfah, an Armenian wedding, a peasant wedding with their priest and all, and the bakers of Lavash, and I really feel very privileged that I own this painting, And since one of my granddaughters is hopefully soon to be engaged to a young, nice, and even more Armenian boy, I said, that will be your wedding gift. Next. And this is done on newspaper, a new kind of Sampad creation done on newspaper. Now, I have only one long chapter on Tehran, even though most of the Armenian community is still in Tehran. According to the bishop, Cebu, there's still 25 Armenian schools in Tehran, which surprised me, as well as a number of kindergartens and other unions. And one of this author who wrote a very large chapter, his name is Yakubian, who teaches at San Bernardino State College, and who has written a whole book on the subject, shows how flexible the Armenians have been in Iran. Gahar Marvin, they adjust to the local situations. And that's one of their ways, and I guess that's a part of Armenian history, is that for Armenians to survive, they've had to adjust, no matter what, the circumstances. And here we find the scout. There's a major scout movement in Iran known as Ararat, the Ararat Scouts. And here they are under Shah, Reza Shah, parading on his birthday with pictures of the Shah, etc. And then next, and here we find after the Islamic Revolution, the Iranian government loves to show this picture of an Armenian martyr who fought in the war against Iraq in the Iranian-Iraqi war and who died, Khanvarian. And they, I think, like to show this in order to emphasize the fact that they're very tolerant of non-Islamic faiths. Next. And here we are. The last time I was in Iran was 1 year before this, in 2005, on the 90th anniversary of the Armenian genocide, and was invited to speak in the Grand Armenian Center of Ararat, which had been given to the Armenians by the Shah, and where was sort of the focal point of the Tehran Armenian community. And here you see in 2006 that their Armenians are being allowed to demonstrate on April 24th, the day of the Armenian genocide. But they were very careful in talking about being very cautious, and the Armenian word is shurchahayats. It means circumspect. They're very circumspect because they said to me, Professor, tu chikailes, you don't walk, because everything is being filmed by everybody. And they didn't want me to become a possible object of an American being there in an anti-Turkish demonstration. I mean, it's a right for them. They're Iranians, and they can do it. So it's very interesting. That was sort of an object lesson of the time. So here they are. They've diminished by perhaps 2/3. They're still there. They're still active, and I hope that they will have a very long, long life. Next. And this is their cathedral now in Tehran of Surp Sarkis. Finally, Glendale, California, where the Armenians from Iran constitute a very large segment and the most prosperous segment of the community who live up in the hills of Glendale, which is a status symbol in Glendale. Next. Here they have their own building of the society, Los Angeles Society, or Armenian Society of Los Angeles, Iranahai Miutyun, right on Louise Street, from where you can smell the best kebab in all of Glendale that is done by Rafi's Kebab. Next. And finally, here you see their Ararat Center in Glendale with the Ararat Scouts and Hominid men, athletes there. And so they're continue to thrive at the same time, acculturating, adjusting, changing, but being proud of their heritage and maintaining, even though they've been in Iran for more than 400 years, and in some cases for more than 1,000 years, still able to maintain their language as their primary means of communication, which for us in America and other countries is most unusual because we know that our second generation already is either unable to or has a very great difficulty in communicating in the language of our parents. So it's a rich history, and I'm glad that even though I was reluctant, in the end I gave in and I spent the 3 years that it took me to edit this volume and to put it out. It happens to be the biggest of the volume. It's nearly 700 pages when you put the index and forward materials together, and I hope that it'll find its place, rightful place, in the history of the Armenian communities. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You know, I had turned the volume level on Professor Hovannisian's microphone up high because I thought, well, the man arrived at about 3 in the morning today, and he's probably going to be tired, and he may not be as loud. Instead, he's gotten louder as this presentation has gone along. But that's good. That's a good thing. So, we will take some questions, and I will start with a Zoom question, and that is, will this important work be translated into Armenian?
Well, that depends on a good translator and a good initiator of that. I have my 4 volumes on the Republic of Armenia were translated into Armenian. It was an enormous undertaking, almost as difficult, if not more difficult, than writing the original, because as you know, no matter how good the translator is, one must follow it. And there's so many idioms in English that simply don't work in any other language. I mean, I give you a very good example. In political matters in the United States, they said they tabled the motion. They tabled it, meaning they gochiterin, they put it on the side. Well, in Armenian, when you table a motion, you put it on the table. It's the opposite meaning. You understand? So unless I, as the author, am able to check those things, I don't know what it will look like. But in any case, there are, certainly I would hope that they would be translated into Armenian. Even more, I hope that there will be Armenian readers in due course, and any readers, as we're moving into a totally different world.
Anyone in the room? All right, there's another Zoom question. What is the state of Armenians today in Tabriz, in Liliva, and in Khala?
These are in Iran. They've diminished. This is Tabriz. These are two, this person obviously knows Tabriz. These are the 2 quarters of Tabriz, where Armenians had a school and churches. Those schools, I was surprised to learn, still operate on an elementary level, even though the community has dwindled greatly. And it's sort of interesting also, I have to know more about it because I haven't really studied it, but there was sort of a class difference also between the 2 quarters, sort of the common working class section as opposed to a merchant kind of section of the city. So they're there in diminished numbers, but they have a archbishop there now, who is Jhulfah, who is very active in trying to preserve the community, and not only preserve the community, but he has traveled around throughout Azerbaijan to document the various communities that existed there and to uncover their chapels and churches and so forth. So at least the historical record will be there. Thank you.
Yes, Joe.
In Tabriz, in that region, how many Armenians remain there?
How many Armenians are remaining in the Tabriz area?
I can't give you an answer. I would say it's probably in the hundreds, or maybe 1,000 or 2. But again, it's like here as well. What is an Armenian? Who qualifies as an Armenian? It's what you, I suppose, choose to be. And some people choose not to be. In Iran, I can't say, but it's in the hundreds, I'm guessing. But historically, I mean, Tabriz was just such an important city for the Armenians. And the Armenian intellectuals who gathered there, especially, for example, after the fall of the First Republic, there was an uprising against Soviet rule. They call it the February Uprising. And with many of the former leaders of the Republic, who then had to cross the Araks River into Iran and who went to Tabriz and centered there for a number of years until the Soviet government pressured the Persian government to get these people out of there. And they ended up in Beirut and other places as teachers and principals and so forth. But for years, Tabriz was sort of an Armenia outside of Armenia.
Yes, sir.
So you showed several maps where Azerbaijan was south of Armenia, and in which the Armenian community in that region seemed to be thriving or well regarded. And there's no linkage between what was going on then and what happened after the First World War to move Azerbaijan into the Russian side that became a Soviet republic. Can you characterize what happened?
Well, it didn't really move. It's just that the people who were creating a new state in Eastern Caucasus chose the name Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan didn't move to the northern side of the river. They chose that name. Why? Maybe because they were thinking about creating a state on both sides of the Araks River. maybe because many of them were had strong Shiite Iranian connections. You know, the Azerbaijanis are interesting because by religion they're related to the Iranians. By ethnicity and language, they're related to the Turks. And there was a struggle among themselves of identity struggle of what are we? Ultimately, it was the Turkish that took root rather than the Shia, even though they still have the same kinds of religious holidays and so forth. So it's a matter of their having taken the name and given it to an area that previously was not known as Azerbaijan at all.
What was it known as?
They had different provinces of, you know, above them was Dagestan, the coastal city was Baku, near Karabakh, there was Karabakh, and Ganja is where the intellectual capital of the Azeri intellectuals and landlords was in Ganja, or the Armenians know it as Ganzak. So it was really sort of a, I won't say by chance, but did not follow, and it's confusing when you see an Azerbaijan on a map here being northern Iran, and then there's another Azerbaijan up there. And one of the reasons that the Iranian government, I think, is not more supportive of Azerbaijan, which is related to them by religion, and seems to be at least a little more supportive of Armenia, is the fact that Azerbaijan today, among them, are many people who are talking about having a united Azerbaijan that would include that area that you saw on the map, where the population is Turkish-speaking, a lot of them. So if you want to dream about having a greater Azerbaijan, it would be not only what was Soviet Azerbaijan with Baku and Ganja, it would also include Tabriz. And so the Iranian government is very much aware and sensitive to maintaining its territorial integrity, and therefore is cool, not hostile, but is not overtly supporting Azerbaijan against Armenia, which is a Christian country, as you know.
Before we take a couple more questions, let me just remind you that, one, Professor Hovannisian's book is available, and he will sign copies as soon as we wrap up here. And for those of you online, I posted the link in the chat if you would like to purchase it. Yes?
So, thank you very much for your talk, Professor. It's always a pleasure to see you. And I wanted to ask you about education. So, to your best estimate, pre-genocide, how many areas of higher learning were there in Armenia?
How many institutions of higher learning were there in Armenia, but what do you mean by Armenia? In the Western Armenia or?
All of Armenia, and even Western Armenia. So we know that, like in Karpat,
Well, look, yeah.
colleges in Houston, right? Was there an area that rivaled that number, or?
Oh, there were numerous colleges. First of all, in Russian Armenia, there was the famous Narcissian Academy of Tiflis. There was the Kevorkian Academy. These are religiously founded schools in Echmiadzin. There were in each of all of the cities, there were gymnasia, which are sort of junior college, high school kinds of things, but even more so in the Turkish Empire. There were numerous colleges that in part were Armenian-sponsored and in part American missionary-sponsored colleges, such as Euphrates College in Kharpert, such as Aintab in Aintab, in Bardizak, in many, many areas there were college level. And sometimes even though they didn't, Marzavan, they didn't necessarily restrict enrollment to Armenians, but as it turned out, 90% of the student body in all these colleges was Armenian.
So the reason I asked the question, Professor, is because if you look at Barton Malcolm's book, which I know you're familiar with, you see that when the new immigrant groups came to the United States, the literacy rate of Armenians was like 92.3%, second only to the people of Israel.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering where did this education...
Well, one of that and the other, when they came to where? I'm sorry.
When they came to America, the literacy rates were
one of
exceptionally
the, I think one of the answers to that also is there was a large percentage of Protestants among the early immigrants coming here. And the Protestant schools were very active in teaching literacy, because if you're a Protestant, you want to read the Bible and have direct communication and not have the intercession of priests. And aside from that, every Armenian village by 1915 had a school, at least one school. I mean, my father's village of Bazmashen in Kharpert had 3 schools. It was the one village. But the Apostolics had a school, the Protestants had a school, and the Catholics had a school. It means that literacy, even among the peasant population, was a priority. I mean, they weren't going to become poets and writers, but they could read. And when I was growing up, I remember that generation. They all waited for the paper to come out, for the Baikar or the Heidenik to come out to be able to read the paper and then to exchange it with their neighbors who received the other paper. And you didn't want to subscribe to it, but you wanted to read it. Yeah.
I think what Professor Hovannisian is trying to say is that the Kharpert Armenians were exceptionally well-educated and intelligent people. I don't mean to put words into your mouth, Professor, but that seems to be what you're getting at. Yes?
Since northern Iran was Persian way before any Azeri was there, in other words, they couldn't have any claim just because they happened to move in there. If they want to be with their Azeris, they should go back.
Well, you know, we can say that about everyone, I suppose. But yes, they came in as Turkic, either as Turkic invaders or they Turkicized the existing population. This is like in Azerbaijan, a big debate as to who are the Azerbaijanis. Are they natives of the area? Are they invaders? Are they a mixture of all of these things? And it comes down to being very political rather than being truly interested in ethnicity or ethnic origins. It's a matter of who owns what, who has a right to what. And the fact is that everybody can claim because the history is so intertwined that, you know, and now, well, I won't go into that, what's going on in Azerbaijani historiography today, but it is so amazing. Yeah.
I want to take one more question from Zoom from Professor Gocek, who would like to know if you have thought of writing your memoirs, and if so, when will they be out?
Professor Gocek, my good friend, you know, did you say Gocek?
Yes.
I have to say first before I answer that, for many years I was urged to go to historic Armenia and to Kharpert to see my father's village and so forth, and I didn't want to go because I didn't want to see what I knew I was going to see. A land of, what shall I say? A complex land that was not mine but was mine but was not mine, where there's so much history, painful history, that I didn't want to see it. And by the time I was ready to go, Muge Gocek, who was University of Michigan, suggested that we travel together. And it was really ironic for me, as someone who has tried to fight denial of the Armenian genocide for so long, that I should end up with my wife Vartiter traveling for the first time to Eastern Turkey and to historic Armenia with a Turkish scholar. His name was Gocek. So I'm forever indebted to you, Muge, for opening the door to later also expeditions with Armin Arayan and the NAASR summer groups, which were immemorable, wonderful explorations, and never being able to resolve what we feel, never be able to come to terms with everything, but learning that people are people, that hospitality doesn't stop with boundaries of ethnic groups or religious groups, that we're part of sort of the human race, and if these damn governments would leave us alone, we might all be able to live together. And ultimately the question is no. I've been asked many times to write memoirs, and I can't do that. It's writing about yourself, and it's sort of taking credit for things that people think you've accomplished. And I have a hard time with that. I have been interviewed a few times, and that's helpful. My grandson has written a book, Family of Shadows, which has some of my family history. But autobiography, well, you know, nothing is permanent, and I appreciate the question, and I want to reiterate that I appreciate you.
Well, there are many other messages expressing people's thanks on Zoom, and I think everyone here would like to express their appreciation as well. So let's stop there because it's getting late, and I know Professor Hovannisian would like to sign some books and get some sleep tonight because he's giving another talk tomorrow. So to everyone, I say thank you and see you again in person or on the computer or somewhere. Good night.